I, are we, are, yes, we are live. Okay. I'm waiting 1 second to see if any other people pop up, giving it a moment. And it looks like everybody who was joining, at least at first, is in. I think I will go ahead and start because we have limited time. So welcome everyone um, to our panel today, Opportunities and Obstacles, Law, Policy, and Smart Growth in South Florida and the Everglades. My name is Ansley Sampson. I'm General Counsel at Everglades Law Center, and I am your moderator today. We have three amazing panelists. First, Lauren Janitis, Executive Director of Tropical Audubon Society, and then Elizabeth Fatah Carpenter, the Executive Director at Everglades Law Center, and lastly, but not least, Erin DeMaio, architectural designer and urban planner with Future Vision Studios. We are so thrilled to have you here and have you here talking to us about this very timely topic. I wanted to kick us off very quickly with a little background framing of what smart growth is. So, smart growth has been around for a long time with different definitions in different places, but a touchstone is the concept of sustainability, the ability to provide for the current generation without adversely affecting future generations. And this generally encompasses planning that identifies and encourages livable, walkable communities, access to open space, and thoughtfully designed transit corridors with the goal of protecting both communities and the environment. Now, the question of smart growth in South Florida has another layer because the land on which we live was often underwater historically. So any discussion of smart growth here needs to address these questions in the context of water, both our history with development and flood management in the Everglades, as well as living in a time of increasing saltwater intrusion and heavier rains and storms. So with that very brief introduction, I will kick off our panel addressing first the why behind smart growth in Florida, then the policies that can help with some details on how those policies can be implemented, and then lastly, how communities can get involved. And so with that, Lauren Janitis, my first question is for you. How do stronger conservation measures, Everglades protection and preserving the urban development boundary impact quality of life, lifestyle communities, and the economy in South Florida? And I am going to rely on you to define urban development boundary as we kick ourselves off. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Ansley, and happy to be here. And thanks for, everybody turning up about this important conversation. So that's really a great question because this really is where environmental protection and everyday life intersects. So, when we talk about stronger conservation measures, Everglades restoration, and preserving the urban development boundary line, or I'll refer to that as the UDB, we're really talking about safeguarding the foundation of South Florida's economy and like really our quality of life. So let me define the UDB first. We're based in Miami-Dade County, and the UDB is really a line that defines the edge of urban growth, right? So inside the line, development is supported by public infrastructure, like water, sewer, and roads. And then when you have outside the line, that's really meant for agriculture, open space, and environmental preservation. So Miami-Dade County created this, the UDB to really prevent urban sprawl from creeping into places like the Everglades, our, Biscayne Bay coastal wetlands, and then also our farmlands, right, our agriculture. And these are like the very systems that keep our region functioning. So that's why we need to, protect those areas. So, preserving the urban development boundary line and those areas beyond it really directly protects our drinking water supply, right? So that's for over 9 million residents. It also protects our wetlands and our mangroves, allows them to, be healthy, which means less flooding for us, right? And less storm damage. That's that green infrastructure that we need to protect us. It also sustains our property values because, people pay more to live near clean water and green spaces. And also, preserving the UDB, it's protecting the Everglades, right, in those critical areas, which those are the areas that fuel our recreation and our tourism. So fishing, boating, bird watching, and all those outdoor experiences that are really central to our way of life, and I would say our local economy. So I do want to talk about now, how the numbers really tell the story. So the Everglades alone provides 31.5 billion each year in ecosystem services, which is pretty incredible, right? And that number also includes, property values, recreation, storm protection, and biodiversity. And also, as many of us know on this call, we're moving through many different Everglades restoration projects, some that are, moving forward, some that have already been completed. And Everglades restoration actually offers a 4-to-1 return on investment. So that generates about 46 billion in benefits for 11 billion in cost of restoration. And many of folks on this call might be interested in these numbers. And this is all in a report recently released by the Everglades Foundation. It's an economic report that looks at all this. And they actually find that the Everglades is a $1 trillion asset. So that's just unbelievable, and even more reason why, we need to protect these areas. I also want to mention Biscayne Bay too, because Miami-Dade County did an economic report, and they found that Biscayne Bay generates 64 billion in economic output annually. So, going back to this question, when people say, why does conservation matter? Why does preserving the UDB matter? And, the answer is really simple. If we push development west, we're really threatening our aquifer that provides our drinking water. We're losing those natural buffers that protects us from storms. And we, potentially destroy the very ecosystems that drive our economy. So if we keep the boundaries strong and really invest in Everglades restoration and invest in making smart, forward-thinking choices, revitalizing urban areas, reducing sprawl, saving taxpayer money, and protecting the natural systems that make South Florida so unique and desirable, that's what we need to do to move forward as we're growing in Miami-Dade County in particular. So I just want to say in the end, conservation isn't just, people think conservation and they think protecting wildlife and natural areas, but it's protecting what makes South Florida livable. I would say also protecting what makes us resilient and also economically strong. Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, that's a great introduction to why smart growth matters in South Florida in particular. Those are impressive numbers. Turning to Elizabeth Carpenter, a little bit more on the why. And as we have sort of been talking about, water is always in the mix when we talk about conservation in this state. What does smart growth mean in terms of our water policies and adaptation in South Florida?
Yeah, thanks, Ansley. I think Lauren just did a phenomenal job framing the value of our environment, and I was hoping to talk a little bit more about how those environmental resources that we have interact with our urban environment, and kind of help set the stage for the constraints and the opportunities that the natural environment provides us with when we talk about growing in the urban environment and avoiding sprawl, in our natural resources. So, we know everyone knows the Everglades are to the west of us, but the water in our area in South Florida, we developed in a very wet area that used to be the Everglades. Miami-Dade County used to be a transverse glade system. And historically, and to this day, water originates in the Everglades on the west side and kind of west to east moves through the urban environment from the Everglades, through downtown Miami, through our communities, through our commercial sectors, our industrial sectors, and moves all the way east out to Biscayne Bay. And as it's moving through the city, it's obviously interacting with the urban environment there. So it's during high tides or during rainy seasons, it's causing flooding. It's backing up into impervious surfaces, into parking lots, into areas that don't have natural green infrastructure like bioswales and open spaces. And at the same time, all of the things that we're doing on land with industrial facilities and stormwater and trash and car oil and pollution and things like that that we're doing on land are also ending up in that water and flowing east to Biscayne Bay. So there's this feedback loop between the water from the natural environment and the water in the urban environment. And any growth and any smart growth that we want to think about in the future has to consider the realities of that situation. And of course, as the sea continues to rise and we're experiencing more extreme storm events with climate change, that potential conflict between the natural resources and our built environment is only becoming heightened. So even if you're not a natural lover of the environment, protecting our open spaces and environment is protecting our way of life, as Lauren said earlier, and protecting our ability to continue to live in Miami-Dade County into the future in the face of climate change and sea level rise. So I think, Aaron is hopefully going to talk about this. He's the expert on this, but I think that really helps frame the realities of the environment that we're in, both the natural environment and, the reality of the environment. Um, we are working on a lot of adaptation and resiliency projects in Miami-Dade County. I think that South Florida has something like the highest level or highest amount of federal projects focusing on resiliency in the whole country. And that's wonderful. But I think what we're finding is that these great resiliency projects that we're working on, like the Back Bay study or the Reasonable Assurance Plan or improving stormwater management and stormwater permitting, are kind of working in a silo and are not thinking about the impacts of future growth or redevelopment or existing infrastructure as they're moving forward. So working on integrating some of our resiliency strategies with our growth and redevelopment strategies, I think is going to be absolutely critical for our long-term ability to live and thrive in Miami-Dade County.
Thank you, Elizabeth. That was great. That sets it up. So we've now heard a little bit about the urban development boundary and a little more about the relationship between the Everglades and our urban ecosystems in South Florida. Erin, you focus on the how we actually grow smarter inside the urban development boundary. From an urban design and planning perspective, what does the urban development boundary, the UDB, mean for the way we build, and how can good design help us grow more resiliently?
Exactly. The urban development boundary isn't just a line on the map. It's a multidisciplinary challenge that we work through as we develop and grow. It asks, how can we grow inwardly instead of outwardly? And how can we make existing neighborhoods even more livable, walkable, and economically productive? So when we're looking at that from an architecture, from a planning, from a design lens, some of the principles are utilizing urban design as infrastructure itself. So how we build compact, connected neighborhoods with tree-lined streets, creates shaded sidewalks, and green water infrastructure lets us manage stormwater and heat through the design decisions. And these also reduce energy costs and create more opportunities to enjoy outdoors and lessen dependence on gray infrastructure, letting nature do more of that infrastructural work. We see examples like sprawl repair, which is retrofitting areas that we already have, for instance, shopping malls that may no longer be utilized or large shopping plazas with lots of parking lots. That's a concept being spearheaded a lot by Galena and DPZ Co-Design, who's located right here in Miami, where they show options to transform those areas into more walkable mixed-use neighborhoods. That reuses the existing infrastructure, which is efficient, reduces car dependence, and it strengthens the tax base of those neighborhoods. And doing so, though, is required that the zoning code can allow that type of development to happen. And not just larger projects like that of sprawl repair, it can also mean smaller scale projects like a townhome or a brownstone, which are extremely successful, as we can see from the cost of those types of neighborhoods and those types of places to live. Since those are in demand, we can try to adjust the zoning code to ensure that we can build more of those types of places where it's more walkable, because there might be the zoning that allows for a corner store or a bodega at certain intersections. By doing so, it reduces our dependence on car infrastructure. And also adding other types of housing choices. It doesn't necessarily mean just townhouses. It could be accessory dwelling units being allowed behind an existing home so people can grow in place, so families can be closer to each other. And so housing, which is currently on larger parcels that might be too expensive for a new family, can be offset through that additional rental income. So this pursuit of affordable housing that we see of expansion, where the cost is often hidden in the additional fuel and transportation and time costs of moving to this new housing that's further out, can often kind of conflict with this ability to do sprawl repair. But if we even looking at new construction that might be kind of far from urban core, it doesn't necessarily have to be done in the same process. It can be done with new urbanism, with garages that are accessed from rear alleys, where there's tree-lined streets that aren't bisected with lots of driveway and curb cuts. So when you're walking on a sidewalk, it's safe and continuous. And doing so also can help create a green network, which is envisioned by the county in the Parks Master Plan. So that starts from your doorstep all the way to our great parks on the east of Biscayne Bay and on the west of the Everglades. But doing so, starting at a tree-lined street, allows all of those connections to happen.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much. So building on that, let's talk a little bit more about implementation. What does it actually take to make smart growth happen inside the UDB, and how do cost factors like insurance, infrastructure, and long-term resilience come into play? And if there's specific examples you have from Miami-Dade County and what's worked and what hasn't worked, that might be helpful in sort of understanding where we're at right now in South Florida, at least in one place with the UDB.
We make a lot of our decisions when we're designing new projects. We're highly data driven. We do a lot of research. There is a lot of data out there, and by combining that research, we can start to see which factors make more sense, because every planning decision comes with a price tag. Insurance premiums, infrastructure upkeep, and long-term maintenance costs. It's about financial resilience as well as quality of life. So as long as we have the option to continue pushing the UDB, it creates an upside for that speculation and sprawl. And that kind of development comes with a cost of competing against other alternative developments inside the boundary. And it makes that less of a priority. But ensuring that we keep the UDB and not allow that exception, would allow for more attention to the focus on sprawl repair. So when we look at the cost of sprawl repair, the cost of sprawl, which includes extending roads and utilities, and then also looking to maintain them, it's about 38% higher in upfront infrastructure costs and 10% more per year. That's according to Smart Growth America. And then when you look at studies from Urban 3, which does great financial analysis on urban plans, both existing and proposed, they can show that compact infill directly yields to 10 times more tax revenue on a per acre basis, which is very, very significant. And oftentimes those infill areas, those downtown type areas, actually subsidize that sprawl. So insurance costs also have to be accounted for, because it's not just the projects that are out on those more susceptible areas that are paying that cost. It's actually spread amongst the community and may also allow for less insurance options for everyone around. So how we design our streets is really important for that insurance cost, for the land use policy within those boundaries of the private properties, because creating tree-lined streets, for instance, can shorten trips. It can allow for children and elderly to have more mobility that may be not able to use a car or afford a car. So it actually is a societal aspect as well in mental health, allowing more people to get around without the use of private vehicles. So to make sure that we can do that, make sure that we can continue to build in this more inclusive way, it's important that the rules are really well defined. Knowing what you can and can't do would allow for more people to want to take those processes at play. When there's too much ambiguity, it makes development harder, and that lengthens the development cycle and just makes more work for all of those design professionals involved, which there are a lot of design professionals in each development. So the existing policies and master plans that we have in place, for instance, the City of Miami's Park Master Plan, the county's Park Master Plan, the Stormwater Master Plans, all of these plans have policies related to what I've just described. So there already are options on the table, not even accounting for adding in new smart codes, like making sure that we adjust policies on less risky land. So there's more work to be done in ensuring that we continue to incentivize infill development and these smart growth policies, but simply working toward implementing those specific aspects that already exist would be a great step forward.
Thank you. Great. Turning back to Elizabeth, looking a little even beyond the UDB and some of those specifics, what legal tools or policies currently exist to protect environmentally sensitive lands from development? And can you give us some examples of when they've been used successfully?
Sure. Yeah, Aaron did such a great job kind of outlining some of the tools we have for growth within the UDB. And of course, we've been talking about the UDB and the CDMP, which is the Comprehensive Development Master Plan, that at least, in Miami-Dade County, we've been focusing on a lot. So that's, of course, a tool. But taking a step back and kind of looking at a more diverse variety of tools, we think about ownership a lot as a big one. So, for example, the federal government owns Everglades National Park. They own Biscayne Bay National Park and Big Cypress Preserve, and those lands have a much heightened level of protection by being in that particular type of ownership. That's the federal level. The state also has all kinds of programs, like the Wildlife Corridor Program under Florida Forever. There have been agricultural lands protection program, and the water management districts own a lot of land that they need to ensure flood protection and resiliency, and rights of ways along their works of the district and canal system. And then, of course, this is a non-exhaustive list, but I'm kind of previewing some of the different buckets of protections that exist legally. To federal, state, and then at the local level, as we said, we just talked about the CDMP, but the county, Miami-Dade County, also has something called the Environmentally Endangered Lands Program, where they purchase lands and they're held in protection and trust for the public. Cities own a lot of lands, moving top to bottom, and a lot of the programs that Aaron was mentioning, related to stormwater, bioswales, incorporating that type of green infrastructure into the urban core. City and municipal ownership is absolutely critical to that. So that's a really important tool in our toolbox, for protecting, not only the communities, but the environment and water quality in our cities. And then, of course, there's the kind of classic legal tools like conservation easements. And the biggest one is Everglades restoration, the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan, which Lauren kind of touched on at the beginning, is designed to restore basically the plumbing of South Florida, and not just our waters, but our communities and our drinking water into the future. And so I think there's not a shortage of buckets. There's a lot of tools out there. Not to mention, I didn't even touch on some of the federal environmental laws, like the Endangered Species Act, which says you can't take or harm endangered species and some of their habitats, the Clean Water Act, the National Environmental Protection Act. So there's lots of tools. The problem that we're running into is that despite there being a lot of tools, sometimes these tools are not being appropriately applied or followed. And that's when you try to work with groups and developers to follow the laws, but at the end of the day, when that doesn't work and it's not successful, you have litigation as a last step. And so you asked about a good example of when that has worked. I think at Florida Climate Week last year, we had talked about this case, but it's become relevant again. The South Dade Logistics Center, I think, is a great example of that. This was a proposed 400-acre industrial property that was going to be placed in agricultural lands outside the UDB that had been specifically flagged for Everglades restoration and restoration of Biscayne Bay. And it was it is one of the best performing pieces in the modeling and planning that is occurring under this Everglades restoration project. So despite the CDMP, the local laws and the state laws saying you cannot approve a development in this area, the development was still approved by the county commission. And that's when the legal tools really get tested. And so Everglades Law Center, along with our partners, filed a petition challenging this development, and then we intervened in a state action that was challenging the development on procedural grounds. And it's really interesting because before we even filed this lawsuit, the amount of public pushback and community involvement that folks on this call, and I hope some of the people in our audience as well, pushed to prevent this from happening was really phenomenal. And Tropical Audubon was involved, Hold the Line Coalition, Friends of the Everglades, and many other ones. And so, despite commissioners and staffers being told that this is not legal, you cannot do this project, it was still approved. And so at the end of the day, we were able to prevail and the procedural grounds. And I think we filed that lawsuit 2 or 3 years ago. And to this day, that is undeveloped agricultural land that is still available for Everglades restoration. Developers have unfortunately filed another application to try again. And so the fight continues, but our wonderful partners are focusing on that. The lawyers are focused on that. So, at Everglades Law Center, we kind of try to advocate for the initial correct application of the tools and the rules we have in place to protect our communities and environments. But when all else fails, we have litigation as the kind of final recourse for that. So if that answers the question.
That does.
Yeah,
Yes.
I just chime in too with that particular project, the South Bay Logistics Center, all, the groups on this call and many others, it's not that we're against all development. We're trying to promote development in the right spaces. So this particular project was fascinating because it was really, against the CDMP of the county and, fails what's called the needs test for it to be, constructed outside the UDB, which really meant that it could be done inside the UDB. But, they were really trying to push for that. So it was just us really advocating and saying, hey, we don't need to, extend the UDB at this point for this particular project because this particular industrial type development can be done inside the UDB. And it's not that we're against development. We're just wanting it to be done the correct or right way.
Yeah, thank you, Lauren, for that clarification. Absolutely. This was to move the urban development boundary to encompass this 400 acres when the county staff said there's no need to move the development boundary. There's enough space within existing zones inside the urban development boundary to develop that there. So that's a really important point, Lauren. And I know we discuss that all the time is that development, plays a really important role in our society. It just needs to happen at the right time and in the right places.
That was great. I'm going to ask one sort of follow-up question to all of you before we move on to the last piece in our panel, which is how people can get involved. And that is just, y'all have explained pretty well the why behind smart growth, as well as the details and some policies. Do you have a sense right now how effective these policies are being used in South Florida? Like on balance, I'm hearing that there are a lot of policies that we have, and the UDB is reasonably unique among cities in the United States, I believe. But the question is, like to the point you were making, Elizabeth, and you too, Lauren, like how effectively has it been implemented? Do you have a grade or a sense of where we're at in the way we're using the policies now versus how much more we need to do? And I'm surprising my panelists by throwing out this question. That's how I play.
So some of the examples that I think that are positive is there's one that's pretty recent, and the City of Miami Commissioner Ralph Rosado just proffered a resolution to ensure that there's a coordinator to make the Miami Loop more implemented, right? It's a plan for 223 miles of trail connecting multiple trails together, for instance, the Ludlam Trail, the Underline, and that is a great portion of the county's park master plan, which I mentioned. So this was a great step in the right direction toward dedicating resources toward that implementation. And I think that project will then allow for other more smaller scale projects related to pedestrian and bike infrastructure to also start to be implemented on a local scale, because those will connect to that more large scale. You can think of this Miami Loop almost like the Metro rail system. It's like the big spine of this pedestrian and bike network. And then you have, like, for instance, smaller connection points. And then that in turn can help spur new, less car-centric developments along those routes. So if there is a dedicated way where you can bike to your job every day and it's safe and you feel comfortable, you might be more likely to not have to use a car, have one less car in your household, which then makes the development community more confident in designing projects that allow for that kind of a curated lifestyle to happen. So I think that one, that project alone, Miami Loop, would allow for more people to get exercise and really kind of push closer toward those CDMP goals.
Good to hear there are projects in the pipeline that will move the region closer to a smart growth framework that's more effective.
I was going to jump in and say too, I think that there's a lot of really amazing things happening to address, the multifaceted nature of this problem. I think one of the biggest hurdles that we're seeing is the lack of integration between those projects. So Aaron talked about all these great things that I learned something new from Aaron every time he talks about these things. But we were recently just talking about Miami-Dade County's open space master plan and how that is not being fully utilized or implemented. And so there's opportunities for these various planning processes and efforts to work together more collaboratively. And I mentioned that in the first question that you asked me, Ansley, about the lack of integration with some of these resiliency projects. And so I think that a lot of individual projects are being implemented, but they're not necessarily achieving their full potential because they're not working together as a whole package. And that's a big lift. That's hard to do, but I think it's absolutely critical that is done in order to achieve the purpose of all these individual projects.
Yeah, Elizabeth, you're spot on. I was going to say, to answer what Ansley was asking earlier too, is, I think the urban development boundary is a solid foundation, right? It's solid. But really, what you just said, Elizabeth, is spot on. Like, its success really depends on how aggressively we're coupling it with transit investment, zoning reform, fiscal incentives, right? And resiliency planning, I would say. I think it's been the weakest. It's not weak in the idea of it, but it's, weak in consistency, enforcement, and then also I would say political resolve as well. So
no, that's a nice array of responses to that question. And I think it really helps frame the backdrop that y'all have given so far about smart growth in the region. And so Lauren, turning it back to you now, what role does public engagement play in shaping smarter growth policies, and how can residents be better informed and involved in addressing some of these problems that y'all have set out?
yeah, this is such an important question. And, good planning isn't just a technical process. It really is a people process, in my opinion. And that's what, we do at Tropical Audubon Society, is really just trying to get the community and the public engaged in these planning processes and being more involved and informed. And I really think, public engagement is what keeps growth policies grounded in community values, right? So when our residents are informed and they're involved, land use decisions start to reflect what people really care about. From clean water, or I don't want to sit in traffic anymore, or I don't want my, house to be flooding, and, overall quality of life in their neighborhoods. So, an engaged public really allows and holds our decision makers accountable. So, when people understand how the decisions are made, they could really push back against unsustainable projects and, advocate for their communities, advocate for smarter, more resilient growth. And, I think only, engagement works if information is accessible, though. So again, that's something we try to do at Tropical, is always trying to, and I know Everglades Law Center and many other groups, always trying to make, information accessible. So that means reaching people early before decisions are finalized, right? And using diverse platforms, town halls, online tools, workshops, even this, right? This is a way to get folks engaged and informed. And we need to meet, in my opinion, we need to meet residents where they are and not expect them to be navigating complicated government websites or hearings on, weekday afternoons, which we tend to run into a lot here in Miami. But I want to mention that's something that Miami-Dade County I know is really trying to improve, and they have many resources. I also want to mention the Hold the Line Coalition, which is a group of many different organizations coming together, really advocating for preserving the urban development boundary line and really explaining why that's important and getting the community involved in that. And that's where they really can learn about why it matters. And I also want to mention Miami-Dade County is going through their, it's upcoming now, their EAR cycle or their evaluation and appraisal review period, which is really looking at updating the comprehensive development master plan that was referenced earlier. And this is really, really crucial in Miami-Dade County. It happens every 7 years. And there's going to be a series of, almost, I believe, town halls starting, mid-October, where the public can come and talk about what they care about and be part of that process in updating our comprehensive development master plan. So to me, public engagement isn't just helpful, it really is essential. It turns planning from something done to communities into something that's done with them, ensuring that we grow in a way that really protects, our people and the ecosystems we love. I'll close with that.
No, that's great. And I don't know enough. Tropical Audubon is a great way to stay up to date about these opportunities. So I hope anyone listening right now, if I'm not exactly sure the process, but it would be great to get on the mailing list so they can so they can stay informed if you're interested in that. I just want to flag that quickly.
Yeah, so just website, and I also want to give Hold the Line Coalition as well. They have a great newsletter for staying in these things.
Right. I mean, also Everglades Law Center, but in terms of like community outreach, I think it's, Tropical is a great place and Hold the Line probably too. Before we sort of move on to big picture questions, I'm not seeing any questions in the chat, but I want to flag for the audience this, as you know, since I've already thrown some questions at my panelists that we hadn't planned for before, they are open and ready and willing to answer your questions. So if you have a question that you are dying to have answers, please post it, and I think it's the Whova platform, and it will be forwarded to us. So feel free. And while I wait for that, I'm going to ask one other question, which is, what do you on the panel think is the biggest threat or the biggest threats to smart growth in South Florida right now? I mean, we can talk about threats to the environment or to community generally, but I'm interested in threats to smart growth in particular. If there are challenges that will undermine, I'm thinking of the tools you've already mentioned, effective implementation of the urban development boundary altogether, some of those land acquisition and protection programs that you mentioned, Elizabeth, and others. So are there specific threats coming up that will undermine the tools we have now that have allowed us, to a degree, to grow somewhat smartly in South Florida? Again, I'm throwing it out there.
Yeah, I would say there's probably two main things I would point out. The first would be when the UDB is able to be moved, it is adversely affecting infill or non-sprawl development. Even having that as an option puts additional pressure. So I think that needs to just be clear. Like passing that doesn't allow, and then there would be more focus on infill development, and then really trying to meet the market. And as we heard from Lauren, not letting planning be done to a community, but with a community. I think that was a great way of phrasing it. That when infill happens, there's all different types of it. It could be on a corridor, a small multifamily building. It could be a townhouse or a brownstone. And I think that infill development, while doing so respectfully to each neighborhood, is going to be key. And blanket zoning that makes adjustments to, for instance, an entire city sometimes may not always be that of may not be the right decision. A more nuanced zoning approach, like for instance, what's called like an overlay, where the context is studied. What are the street widths in this neighborhood? What are the types of transportation connections? What's the existing right of way dimension with trees, et cetera? Like what is the topography? And kind of really using a lot of data to drill down and then coming up with an overlay district for each neighborhood could allow for there to be less opposition to change, which oftentimes when you do smart growth, the change is amazing and the community ends up loving it from a usability perspective, from a financial perspective, but sometimes change can be scary. So ensuring that there's nuanced overlay districts, I think would get more buy-in from community to allow for that infill to happen.
Are there communities in South Florida that are already doing that work, or is that mostly something that we need to be thoughtful about bringing in?
In the city of Miami, there are multiple overlay districts, and there's also neighborhood conservation districts. And NRDs and NCDs both have specific rules that are over and above the standard transect designations and rules. So those include, for instance, Coconut Grove as an NCD, Wynwood Norte as an NRD, and there'll likely be more of those as more nuanced codes need to be adopted. And I think that concept is going to continue to expand. The blanket overlays they just create a lack of attention to context. That our neighborhoods have been built out and those communities have certain ways of living that need to be addressed in future growth scenarios.
Yeah, that's helpful. Lauren, Elizabeth, do y'all have thoughts?
Yeah, I was going to add, broadening the question just a little bit about challenges generally, but I think kind of two things I wanted to address was kind of the inertia of the way we've always done things. So we had a lot of open land in the past and room to grow and room to expand outward, and we're reaching the end of that kind of unlimited expansion outward. But people are still thinking about development in the same way that they did. And so shifting the narrative and the inertia of this is how we've always done it and starting to think about some of the tools and ways of thinking that Aaron has talked about, I think is a big challenge. And Lauren basically talked about the same thing with the communities. And then I also think I feel like I'm a broken record now on the siloing of a lot of different great programs that are designed to accomplish the same goals. I think that kind of passing the buck is becoming a problem. With moving the UDB, for example, I think it's easy to say, oh, we'll just move it this one time. But then you set the precedent that, okay, if there's enough pressure or enough will, we can move it again. And then there's other resiliency projects that are happening in the county and say, oh, well, just this one city is not complying, or just this one resiliency project won't address compound flooding, for example. And when you start saying some other project will handle this or some other person will deal with it, there becomes kind of a universal failure in the system to address all of the issues. And so again, coming back to the integration and working together, I think the ease of which it is to say this is just an exception is holding us back from a comprehensive solution.
Yeah, I would agree. Yeah, I agree. And one thing to add too, just as you're talking to Elizabeth, is one thing that a challenge we continuously face is now, specifically with Miami-Dade County, our commissioners have term limits. And so these things like the CDMP and the UDB, and when we have these applications coming in to expand the UDB, there's a lot of education involved, right? So some of these newer commissioners that are coming in aren't as familiar, and it's a lot of to learn and understand the importance of why we have these things in place. So that's been a little bit of a challenge, just educating on the overall This is the reason why we have the UDB. This is the reason why we have a CDMP, and we can't just look at this as a case by case basis. Oh, we're going to expand the UDB one time because of this, pressure. All of it's connected, and sometimes with the fact that we have term limits, like I said, is a little bit of a struggle because there's a heavy lift in educating about why it's so important. So I'll close with that.
Yeah, those are interesting. I mean, there are three different points you all have raised, which is interesting. One is the ways in which we make sure our decision-making governmental structures empower communities to shape the way development happens to them. Sort of how, making sure it's very community-based. Two, this passing the buck problem. I was particularly interested in what you said, Elizabeth. Like historically, we've been able to grow outwards and avoid some trade-offs, or at least we thought we could. And it's becoming harder and harder to do that. And so, now you have this buck passing going on. And then this idea that you need to make sure it's hard to keep all of your elected officials informed too when you have that kind of transition. That's sort of interesting, three different challenges that I think it's good to focus on. We actually have a question now, and it's a pretty good specific one, which is, I have always heard it is cheaper to clear land and develop than it is to develop an already developed than it is to develop an already developed space. Is this a true statement? And if so, are there incentives for developers to develop already developed properties and change end uses?
That's a great question. And different developments are going to cost different amounts based on construction type, based on efficiency of the design and materials being utilized. And I think, though, that kind of gets to the crux of the issue of passing the buck, that just because something's cheaper now doesn't mean it's what should be done. That building, when things are done in a development capacity of sales, like for instance, a condo or a home that's sold, where that new responsibility is then taken on by that owner and also possibly by that municipality who might take over that infrastructure, it allows for a progress of maybe not making the best decisions in the long run for the future inhabitants. And smart growth, to me, I think, is just in sustainability, making sure that we can take care of ourselves while also not hindering future generations. And in doing so, making our decisions to allow for resource efficiency, resource conservation, both energy-wise and material carbon, embodied carbon, I think is critical. So as far as the cost of a clear cut, a green field versus an infill, it's not only the cost that you're looking at to see if a project pencils, it's also on the revenue generated. So is there still demand for houses that have 50% or 80% of their facade as a garage, where you walk down the sidewalk and there's cars blocking the sidewalk because they're parked over like in the driveway, and you can't really walk down the sidewalk with your children? Or is there more demand and possibly revenue in other styles of development? And the market will have to help determine that. But I'm hopeful that the economics continue to allow for, and the zoning code incentivizes policies that align with smart growth. For instance, transit, TOD type incentives in the city. There is the live local incentive from the state. The county has the RTZ incentive. The city also just created the TSND incentive. So all of those are incentives to design projects around transit, as one example. But there can be nuanced examples at different levels in different neighborhoods based on whatever metrics they're trying to achieve. And I think that is going to really help drive those decisions, as well as, even if those types of decisions continue to be made, that there should be a level of future proofing added. And by that, I mean, ironically, future proofing doesn't actually mean that we know the future. It's actually the opposite. It's allowing for potential alternatives of the future. And one of the main ways we can do that is through the height of buildings. So even if projects are going to continue to be built further out, ensuring that the freeboard height of the ground floor of those is built at a certain level, that it's reducing the flood effects, that project can be raised in the future over time. So it's a complex question, but I I would point you to look at maybe Kronberg Urbanists. They have some presentations, and also Urban 3. They have the financial analysis that can go a lot deeper than this answer.
I have a quick follow-up question on that. I mean, I hear you that markets can evolve and like the different preferences of consumers can drive smarter growth. But then you also mentioned several incentives that maybe everyone else on this call knows, but I was not sure. The TOD, RTD, just a little bit information about those local incentive programs and how they incentivize growth in transit corridors.
Yes, I used acronyms there. So there's starting at like the higher level, there's the state level Live Local Act, which is allowing for increased height and density and approval process being streamlined if under certain conditions, if a certain percentage of units are capped at a certain rent based on the surrounding area. Then at the county level, there's RTZ, which means rapid transit zone, which are districts around the metro rail stations and metro mover stations, allowing for additional development rights because of the proximity to high levels of transit. And then the city already had TOD, transit-oriented development options, but they've recently introduced a new proposed option at a new proposed train station of a tri-rail station where they're calling it a TSND, Transit Station Neighborhood Development, I believe is the acronym. And that also allows for increased density and height when certain metrics related to affordability are met. And then, so those are just a few related to density. I've also introduced legislation which is codified now for green roofs. You're allowed a certain amount of capacity on a roof in the city of Miami, and we updated the code where you're now able to build double the amount of interior habitable area on a rooftop if each of those out of 1 per 1 square footage is done so with a green roof. And we're also trying to introduce something called FLORA, floor area legislation for open space and reforestation advancement, which is focused on single family houses, where currently when you have large trees on a property, you have to choose between sometimes depending on where the tree is and your rights of a property, building an addition or a new construction, the allowed amount that you're able to, or keeping that tree. I don't think that those are things that we should be having to decide between. So for instance, the Flora proposal is suggesting that we should allow additional development options in the code right from the start. You can read them right there when you have certain natural resources on a property. So again, that's kind of like a nuanced example of the Flora versus the TOD, which is a much larger kind of regional thing for large scale projects.
No, that's great. I mean, what that says is there are an awful lot of very pragmatic incentivizing approaches to incentivize smart growth and to enable smart growth at all different levels of government. That's super helpful.
Can I add something to the question, Ansley? Just to build on the concept that Aaron started, that's a really complicated question. I'm not an expert in this, but I think there's just so many factors at play. If the cost to a developer for building an apartment complex is one thing, but what about the future costs to the taxpayer and to the individuals living in that home from the infrastructure that might be needed? If you build that in a flood-prone area that's very far away from the city center and from jobs, you now have to build, sewer lines, you have to build electricity, you have to now have another fire station, another police station. All the resources that are needed for a particular area are very expensive to the taxpayer. And I mentioned if that was in a flood-prone area, for example, how much are we now spending in FEMA money or from the water management district or the local government to now design multi-million-dollar flood projects to keep this apartment dry? And then the folks who are living there, when their home floods or they can't drive their car out of the area, how much is that costing them? So I think it's just such a complicated, important question that saying X development cost X to build does not encompass the total cost on society or to the individuals that live there.
It's a great point. And it maybe segues us. We have about 5 minutes left, so I want to segue us into a big picture closing question, which is, you're highlighting some real problems that happen if we don't engage in smart growth, Elizabeth. And we've talked a little bit about how our context may be changing in South Florida in terms of reduced availability of space given the speed of growth, as well as increasing saltwater intrusion, storms, many complicated issues. So if we don't build on and increase our smart growth initiatives that we already have in South Florida to some degree, what may South Florida look like in 20 years? That's one question. And then a second question, and the panelists, you can choose which you answer. What opportunities do we have in the next, in the near future to increase our smart growth initiatives in ways that could help us address some of these challenges?
I'll go first if that's all right. So I'm going to answer the first question. If we don't build on and increase our smart growth, what does it look like in 20 years in South Florida? And in my opinion, if we really don't continue to expand smart growth initiatives, I think what our future will be defined on crisis management rather than resilience. I mean, perhaps that's already happening now in some ways. I think that we really need intentional planning. And if we don't, we're going to see urban sprawl continue to push westward into the Everglades and into our farmlands. And that's, as we talked about, that's going to be weakening our natural system that protects us from flooding, that filters our water and, really sustains our economy. And, we'll see longer commutes. We're going to see, worsening traffic. I mean, we already have a traffic issue that'll be much worse. And our infrastructure will really be stretched beyond capacity, in my opinion. So I think that we really, really need to continue to strengthen and expand smart growth initiatives. And again, that's not anti-development. That's again where and how we grow. Concentrating on housing and jobs in existing urban areas, near transit corridors. That really helps reduce sprawl and, protecting our open spaces. And, I know that's been talked about a bit, but if we could, invest in compact and connected and climate ready communities today, I think South Florida will be, a model in 20 years for sustainable living. So, and if we don't do that, we really risk, our environment and quality of life, that makes us want to live here in the first place.
I can jump in just after Lauren to follow up with that. I think that was such a great summary. I would just kind of do a little callback to the first question that you asked me, Ansley, the interplay between our urban environment and the water. The water is there, it's coming in, it's coming up. That's not, that is only getting worse. So that's water impacting people, right? And the activities that we're doing on the land is impacting the water. And so I think we're going to see, again, assuming we don't do anything, we're going to see worse impacts to our urban environment and worse impacts to our natural environment, and the species that depend on them. I think luckily there's been such a great conversation and we have all these great tools and we have all these, not only existing tools, but new innovative ways of thinking about smart growth. So I think that we're on the right track and there's opportunities to avoid the what happens if we don't do anything question. And this has been such an insightful conversation, I think really helpful to frame that future.
Aaron, you want to close us out with 2 minutes left?
Sure thing. I think there's a lot of great examples of good projects here in South Florida, and those can be looked at for what the future could hold. That's what we do at Future Vision Studios, is try to take a research analytical approach and then find creative solutions of incentives, of managing risks while solving multiple challenges with each project. And things that we've proposed, like for instance, doing temporary floating docks to finalize the Baywalk in Edgewater. And we have an alternative plan for the Back Bay study called Connect and Protect Miami, which I think has a much higher ROI given the alignment that we've chosen, which integrates green infrastructure. And it would allow for a long-term plan, reducing the small kind of Band-Aid projects to allow for each of the neighborhoods to have time to do like a master plan that's nuanced, like what I described earlier. I think that the future could be really interesting if we take that kind of granular approach to neighborhood planning and a regional approach to our infrastructure of transit and resilience. So I'm really hopeful that that will continue, and things like the Miami Loop give me hope toward that.
Thank you so much. We are coming up at the end of our hour. This has been an amazing panel. Thank you so much to all of you here. And that's it.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you so much, everyone.
Bye.